The train hissed as it stopped at the small mountain station, letting out a cloud of steam that blurred the faces of those waiting. When it cleared, a woman stepped down, her dress plain, her hands clutching a worn satchel. Her name was Eleanor Grant, and she had nowhere left to go. People whispered when they saw her. In towns like this, news traveled fast, and so did judgment. That is the one. Someone muttered, the woman who could not bear children. Her husband left her, her parents sold her debts. Eleanor kept her head low. She was not here to start over, she was here to survive. The local innkeeper took pity on her for one night, but made it clear she could not stay. You will have to find work, he said kindly. Try the lumber camp. There is a man up there. Thomas Hale lost his wife last winter, could use help with his young ones. Eleanor nodded, grateful but weary. The next morning she walked up the muddy road that wound through pine trees. The forest smelled of sap and rain. Her boots were soaked, her breath heavy in the cold mountain air. By midday she saw smoke curling above a cabin, tall logs stacked neatly, the sound of an axe echoing nearby. A broad-shouldered man swung it with quiet strength. Thomas Hale. He turned when he saw her, wiping sweat from his brow. Can I help you, ma'am? He asked. His voice was rough but not unkind. I was told you might need someone, she said softly, her fingers tightening on her satchel. To care for your children. I can cook, clean, mend. He looked at her, studying the tired eyes, the worn shoes, then nodded. Come inside, you can meet them. Inside, 4 small faces peeked from behind the doorway. 2 girls, 2 boys. Their eyes were wide, curious but cautious. They had learned loss too young. This is Miss Grant, Thomas said. She might stay a while. The oldest girl, about 12, crossed her arms. We do not need anyone, she said quietly. Thomas gave her a look, but Eleanor only smiled. Maybe you do not, she said gently, but everyone deserves a warm meal. That evening she cooked stew from what little she found, potatoes, onions, and a bit of dried meat. The smell filled the cabin. For the first time in months the children ate without arguing. After the meal Thomas stepped outside. Standing under the stars he could hear the faint sound of Eleanor's voice through the window, soft, patient, reading to his youngest boy from a tattered storybook. Something in him eased. He did not know her story, not yet, but something about her presence felt steady, like the slow rhythm of the river beside the house. Inside, Eleanor tucked the boy under a quilt and sat by the window. The moonlight caught the faint scars on her hands, reminders of the life she had lost, the cruelty she had endured. But here in this quiet cabin, with the sound of children breathing softly nearby, she felt something she had not felt in a long time, a small, fragile hope. Morning came, cold and gray. The mountains were wrapped in mist, and the smell of pine smoke hung in the air. Eleanor woke before the sun. Her hands were stiff from the chill, but she lit the stove and began to cook. The sound of the fire cracking was the only warmth in the room. Thomas stepped out of his small bedroom, fastening his suspenders. He gave a small nod. Good morning, Miss Grant. Good morning, she replied quietly. I made coffee. It is strong, but it will do. He smiled a little, taking the cup from her hand. For a moment their eyes met, just long enough to feel the silence between 2 people who had both lost too much to speak of it. Outside, the forest was alive with sound. The sawmill down the valley had begun its daily rhythm, and the call of crows echoed between the trees. Thomas gathered his tools. Eleanor watched him go from the porch. She noticed the limp in his step, the way he carried his grief in silence. The children stirred soon after. The oldest girl, Clara, was already trying to act like a mother. She brushed her sister's hair and helped the boys with their boots. When Eleanor offered to help, Clara shook her head politely. We are used to doing things ourselves. Eleanor smiled. You should not have to be used to it. That day she cleaned the small cabin, patched torn curtains, washed the children's clothes by the river. The work gave her no rest, but it gave her purpose. By evening the place looked different, brighter. When Thomas returned at dusk, the smell of food met him. Before he opened the door he stopped for a moment, surprised. The table was set neatly, candles flickering. The children were laughing, something he had not heard in a long time. Eleanor looked up from the pot on the stove. Dinner is ready, she said quietly. He sat down slowly. The food was simple, stew and bread, but it tasted like something far greater, like home. He glanced at her across the table, seeing the way her face softened when the children smiled. After supper, Clara played the small tune her mother used to hum on an old harmonica. The sound was rough but filled the room with warmth. Eleanor sat quietly listening, her hands folded on her lap. When the tune ended, she said softly, Your mother must have been a good woman. Clara nodded. She was. Thomas said she was kind, but the fever took her last winter. I have not figured how to fill that space yet. Eleanor looked at the floor for a moment. Then maybe some spaces are not meant to be filled, only tended to. He looked at her again, thoughtful. That night when the house went quiet, Thomas stepped outside. The air was cold and clear. He could see the light of the river below reflecting the moon. He thought of how the cabin had felt that evening, less hollow somehow. Inside, Eleanor stood by the window watching the same moon. She still heard the whispers of her past in her mind, the words unfit, barren, unwanted. But here those words began to fade, replaced by the sound of children's laughter and the steady rhythm of a man working to keep them safe. In that lonely mountain cabin, two broken lives had started to mend, though neither of them yet knew how deep their scars truly went. By the end of the second week, word had spread down the valley and through the town that Thomas Hale had taken in a stranger. Folks at the general store whispered about her over sacks of flour and nails. "She's the one from the train," one woman said. "The barren one. Came from down south, traded away by her own kin." The old blacksmith spat into the dirt. "Thomas always did have a soft heart. He'll learn soon enough." But talk was all that small towns had, and talk could cut deeper than a knife. Eleanor didn't go into town much, but when she did, she felt the eyes on her, sharp, measuring, waiting. She'd keep her gaze low, her bonnet pulled tight, and carry on with her errands. Thomas, meanwhile, worked longer hours. The lumber camp needed hands, and winter was coming. The days grew shorter, the shadows longer, and he'd come home with frost in his beard and silence in his throat. One evening, when the children were asleep, Eleanor left a small bowl of stew for him on the table. He came in quiet as ever, sat down, and began to eat without a word. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "Just eat." He looked up, tired eyes softening. "I wasn't sure you'd stay this long," he said. "Most folks don't." "I've got nowhere else to go," she said. "And the children, they remind me what's worth holding on to." He nodded, staring into the fire. "You're good with them." Clara even smiles now. "That's something I haven't seen since Mary died." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was the kind of quiet that builds trust, slow as the thaw of spring. Days passed, and life found its rhythm. The children began to run to her when they scraped a knee or wanted a story before bed. Thomas fixed her chair when it broke, and she patched his coat when it tore. Still, at night, when the wind howled through the pines, Eleanor felt a strange unease, like the mountains themselves were watching, remembering. One stormy night, there was a knock on the cabin door. Hard and sudden, Thomas opened it to find Martha Crow, the midwife from town, her face pale, her shawl soaked with rain. "Martha," Thomas said, surprised. "You all right?" Her eyes flicked past him to Eleanor. "I need to speak with her. Alone." Eleanor's heart tightened. "What is it?" Martha hesitated, looking at Thomas before she spoke. "It's about your past, child. You need to know something before it finds you first." The wind outside rose, rattling the shutters, and for the first time since she'd come to the mountains, Eleanor felt the cold reach her bones. The fire cracked as Martha stepped inside, shaking the rain from her shawl. The children were already asleep, their small bodies curled near the hearth. Thomas poured her a cup of coffee and left the room quietly, though he lingered by the door just far enough to hear if something went wrong. Eleanor stood still, her hands gripping the back of a chair. She had feared this moment since she arrived, that her past would find her again. Martha's voice was low but steady. "You left more behind than a broken marriage, child. There are things you never knew about what happened after you were sold off." Eleanor's eyes widened. She felt the floor tilt beneath her, but she did not speak. "Your husband did not die as they said," Martha went on. "He was hurt after the fire, but he lived for weeks. Some said he kept calling your name before he passed. I was there when they buried him. His brother swore you cursed him before you fled, said your barren blood brought ruin." Eleanor's throat burned. She wanted to shout, but no sound came out. She simply stared at the floor, her face pale as ashes. "I told them it was lies," Martha continued, "but you know how folks talk. They still whisper of it even now, that you brought misfortune, that any man who takes you in will meet the same end." Eleanor whispered, barely audible, "I never wished him harm. I never wanted any of this." Martha reached out, touching her arm gently. I know, but rumors grow like weeds. You need to be careful, especially now that you found a bit of peace. When Martha left the cabin, the wind outside had turned fierce. Thomas waited a long while before stepping back in. He saw the tremor in Eleanor's hands and the empty look in her eyes, but said nothing. Instead, he simply threw another log on the fire and sat down beside her. The silence stretched between them, soft but heavy. She finally spoke, her voice trembling. They think I bring death, that every man who shows me kindness will pay for it. Thomas stared at the flames for a moment, then said quietly, I do not believe in curses. People make their own ghosts if they stare too long at sorrow. Her eyes filled with tears and she turned away, but he reached out and placed a hand over hers, rough and warm from years of work. Stay, he said, you and the children have given this place a little life again. I will not let old whispers take that from us. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge. The cabin shuddered, but inside the fire burned steady. Two souls scarred by loss sat together in the faint orange light, unaware that the past had already begun its long cold journey up the mountain toward them. The next few days passed under gray skies. The storm had left branches scattered across the yard and the river swelled with melted snow. Eleanor kept the children close, helping them with their chores, while Thomas repaired the fence and cleared the fallen pines. Though life went on, a heaviness hung in the air like a fog that refused to lift. Eleanor worked quietly, but her mind was never still. Every word Martha had spoken replayed in her thoughts, the whispers of curses, the brother who hated her, the fire that had taken everything she had buried those memories deep, but now they clawed their way back into her nights. One evening, as the light faded, she walked to the edge of the forest where the old pine trees stood thick and silent. She knelt there in the damp earth and pressed her hands together, not to pray but to remember. She whispered her husband's name, the one she had tried to forget. She told him she was sorry for the anger, for the way things had ended, for not being strong enough to stay. Behind her, the crunch of boots broke the silence. Thomas stepped from the shadows, his coat damp from the mist. He had followed her without meaning to, drawn by the faint sound of her voice. You do not have to explain, he said quietly. I have seen that look before. She turned slowly, her eyes red. I never cursed him, she said. They said I did, but I only wanted him to forgive me. He nodded. I believe you. For a moment they simply stood there, surrounded by the whisper of pines. The mountain air was cold, but the silence between them was warm, steady. That night, when they returned to the cabin, the firelight danced across the wooden walls. The children were asleep, curled together under blankets. Thomas poured 2 mugs of tea and handed her one. He did not ask questions, he did not need to. Outside, the wind carried faint sounds from down the valley, a horse, maybe, or the echo of a wagon wheel. Eleanor's heart skipped. She set her cup down slowly and moved to the window. Through the mist, she saw 2 lanterns moving along the road, their light bobbing like fireflies in the dark. Thomas followed her gaze. Travelers, he said, though his tone was uncertain. Eleanor's voice dropped low. Not travelers. Her heart knew it before her mind could speak it. Someone was coming, and they were coming for her. Thomas rested his hand on the rifle by the door, just in case. He did not ask why, only said, get the children inside and keep the lamps low. Eleanor obeyed. Her pulse quickened as she pulled the quilts over the sleeping children, whispering soft promises that everything would be all right, though she did not believe them herself. Outside, the 2 lights stopped near the fence. A man's voice called out through the mist, cold and commanding. Thomas Hale, we need to speak to the woman staying with you. The words sliced through the night like a blade. Eleanor's breath caught as she froze by the hearth. The past she had run from had finally found its way to the mountain. The night had grown colder by the time Thomas stepped out onto the porch. Lantern light spilled across the wet ground, glinting off the barrel of his rifle. 2 figures stood by the fence, their horses restless, their faces half hidden beneath wide hats and rain-dark coats. One of them raised his hand. We mean no harm, mister. We're looking for a woman named Eleanor Grant. Thomas did not lower the gun. His voice was calm but hard. What business do you have with her? The man shifted in his saddle. A family matter, sir. Nothing for you to worry about. Family? Eleanor thought the word burned through her chest. She moved to the doorway, watching from the shadows. The taller of the 2 men looked familiar, the shape of his jaw, the way he sat on the horse. Her voice trembled when she spoke. You should not be here. The man turned his head at the sound, his eyes narrowed. Eleanor, so it is you. He dismounted, boots sinking into the mud. I knew you'd run far, but not this far. Thomas stepped forward, rifle steady. That's far enough. The man smirked. I'm not here to fight her husband's kin, want her back, debts left behind to settle. They say she carries a curse and she ought to face the folks she wronged. Eleanor's knees weakened. She knew that voice now. It was her late husband's brother, Charles Grant, the man who had sworn she was the cause of every misfortune that fell upon their land. I've got nothing left of yours, she said quietly. Let me be. Charles took a slow step closer. You've got the only thing left that matters, reputation. You took my brother's name through the mud and you'll come back to make it right, or I'll make sure no one forgets what you did. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. I think you should ride on, Mr. The lady isn't leaving this mountain tonight. For a long moment no one moved, only the wind howled through the pines. Then Charles gave a sharp laugh. Suit yourself, but curses have a way of following where they're not wanted. He swung back into the saddle, motioning to his companion, and the two men turned their horses, disappearing into the mist. Their hoofbeats echoed down the trail long after they were gone. Thomas lowered the rifle, but his jaw was tight. He turned to Eleanor. You should tell me what this is really about. She sank onto the step, her hands trembling. I told you most of it. My husband died in the fire, and they blamed me for everything, for his death, for their bad luck, for not giving him a child. They said my presence poisoned their land. Thomas stood silent for a long time, watching the fog drift through the trees. Then he said quietly, you are not what they say. You have given my children more kindness in weeks than most men find in a lifetime. Eleanor looked up at him, tears glistening in the dim light. I do not want to bring more trouble to your door. He shook his head. Trouble finds all of us sooner or later. The difference is who we stand beside when it comes. The words settled between them like a vow. The wind eased and the forest grew quiet again, but somewhere deep in the valley a wolf howled long and low, as if warning that the peace they had found would not last. Morning came heavy with fog. The forest lay silent under a pale sky, as if holding its breath. The children woke uneasy, sensing something wrong. Even before Eleanor spoke, Thomas had already gone to the ridge to check the tracks from the night before. Eleanor tried to keep her hands steady as she made breakfast, but her mind drifted back to Charles's words. Curses have a way of following. She looked at the children's faces and felt her chest tighten. She could not bear the thought of harm coming to them because of her. Thomas returned near midday, his boots caked in mud. He set the rifle against the wall and said, the men rode east down to the valley, but they're not gone. They camped near the old mill. He looked at her carefully. We'll keep watch tonight. She nodded, though her heart beat unevenly. I never wanted to bring this here. He gave a faint smile. You didn't. Trouble came looking on its own. That evening the mist turned to rain again. The sound of it on the roof was steady, but beneath it Eleanor thought she heard something else, faint cracks like wood splitting. Thomas went to the door, stepped out, and froze. Down the valley a red glow flickered through the trees. The old mill was burning. Flames climbed high, devouring the dry lumber sheds. Sparks flew into the dark like angry fireflies. He cursed under his breath and turned to her. Someone said it. He didn't need to say who. Within the hour the men from the lumber camp arrived at the cabin, faces grim. They said the fire had spread to the edge of the forest and that a horse had been seen fleeing north. Charles's horse. The sheriff would come by morning, but the mountain was too wide to chase him now. That night no one slept. Thomas kept the rifle near the door while Eleanor sat by the window holding the youngest boy close. The fire's glow in the distance painted the clouds blood red. It looked almost like the sky itself was burning. Near midnight Clara came to her quietly. Is it true, Miss Grant? Are you cursed? Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to say no, but the fear in the child's eyes broke her heart. She pulled her close and whispered, the only curse in this world is cruelty, and it ends when we choose to be kind. Clara nodded and buried her face against Eleanor's shoulder. When dawn came the valley was covered in smoke. The old mill was gone, only blackened beams left standing. The sheriff's men rode through asking questions but found no trace of Charles or his companion, only a burned trail leading into the forest. Thomas watched them go and then turned to Eleanor. You're safe here, he said firmly, but his eyes betrayed his worry. He knew a man like Charles wouldn't leave things unfinished. Eleanor looked out across the valley, her heart heavy with dread. The smoke curled toward the sky like a warning. She had fled once before, and it had only brought her ghosts closer. This time she would not run. She would face whatever came, even if it meant losing the little peace she had found. The mountain slept uneasy that night. The wind howled through the pines and the cabin walls groaned with each gust. Thomas sat by the hearth, his rifle across his knees, while the last of the fire burned low. Eleanor moved quietly between the rooms, checking on the children, pulling the quilts tighter around them. She paused by the window, staring into the dark beyond the yard. The forest swayed like a living thing, full of whispers and memories. Somewhere out there she knew Charles was watching, waiting for his moment. Thomas saw the fear in her eyes but said nothing. He simply stood and placed another log on the fire. The light flickered across his face, rough and tired but steady as stone. He finally spoke, low and calm. "You do not have to carry this alone anymore. Whatever comes, we face it here together." Eleanor's voice trembled. "I have brought danger to your door, Thomas. Those men will not stop until they see me ruined or dead." He shook his head, slow and firm. "You brought warmth, not danger. They are the ones who cannot let go of hate. That is their curse, not yours." Outside, the dogs began to bark, sharp and sudden. Thomas rose to his feet and went to the window. 2 lanterns were moving through the trees again. He felt his chest tighten. The same lights as before. Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for the children, waking them quietly. Thomas whispered to Clara, "Take your brothers and sister to the back room. Keep them low. Do not make a sound." Then the first gunshot cracked through the night. The window shattered. Thomas ducked behind the table, returning fire. A scream echoed from outside, followed by another shot splintering the door frame. Eleanor dropped beside him, heart pounding. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the cabin. Thomas reloaded quickly, his face lit by the firelight. "Stay down," he said, his voice steady. She obeyed, clutching the youngest boy against her chest. A shadow moved across the doorway. Charles's voice called out, rough and cold, "You should have stayed gone, woman. This mountain ain't big enough for your kind of bad luck." Thomas fired again, and the figure stumbled back into the dark. The dogs were barking wild, the horses outside shrieking in fear. The night had become a storm of sound and flame. Minutes passed like hours. The shots grew fewer until finally there was silence, only the crackle of the dying fire. Thomas waited, still as stone, then stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised. Through the drifting smoke he saw a man lying near the fence, Charles, still breathing but bleeding into the mud. The other rider was gone, vanished into the trees. Thomas lowered his weapon slowly. Eleanor stood in the doorway behind him, pale and shaking. Charles looked up at her, his eyes filled not with hate now, but regret. He tried to speak, but no words came, only a rasp of air, then nothing. The wind blew through the yard, cold and clean. The forest seemed to sigh, as if the mountain itself had released its breath. Eleanor sank to her knees, tears falling into the dirt, not for the man who had hunted her, but for all the years lost to fear and shame. Thomas knelt beside her, laying a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's done now." But as dawn began to break over the ridge, Eleanor knew something inside her had changed. She was no longer the woman who had fled the world. She had stood and faced it, and though it had taken everything she once was, it had given her something new, the courage to stay. The sun rose slow and golden over the ridge, painting the valley in light. The smoke from the night's fight still clung to the treetops like ghosts, unwilling to leave. The air smelled of ash, pine, and something quiet like forgiveness. Thomas stood by the fence, where the ground was still marked with the signs of struggle. His rifle hung loose at his side. He looked toward the line of trees where the last of the shadows faded, and then toward the cabin where the children's laughter began to break the silence. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but calm. The dawn touched her hair, turning it to gold. She carried a bucket to the well and began to draw water, her movements slow but certain. Her hands still trembled, but not from fear this time, only from the weight of what was done. Thomas turned when he heard her footsteps behind him. She stopped a few paces away, the morning wind tugging at her dress. "It's quiet now," she said quietly. He nodded and wiped his hands on his shirt. "The mountain always goes quiet after a storm." She looked at the ground where the earth had been disturbed. He was gone before the light came. She whispered, "I covered him with stones near the pine grove." Thomas gave a slow nod. "That's a good place," he said. "It'll keep the wolves away, and the children need not see." For a long moment they said nothing, only watched the valley below. As the world began to breathe again, the birds returned, first singing softly, as if testing the morning. The horses wandered back to the fence, heads bowed, grazing. Eleanor spoke again after a while. "I never thought peace could come after such things, not after so much loss." Thomas looked at her and smiled faintly. "Peace don't come to those who deserve it," he said. "It comes to those who fight for it." She turned that over in her mind, then looked toward the cabin where Clara was helping the little ones with breakfast. The smell of bread reached them warm and comforting. Thomas walked beside her back to the porch. The boards creaked under their boots. The world was still bruised but alive again. She sat on the step watching the sky shift from gold to blue. "Do you ever think of leaving?" she asked quietly. "Of taking them somewhere far away, starting over again?" He thought for a while, his eyes on the horizon. "I used to," he admitted, "thought maybe the road still had something for me, but now I think this mountain has given me everything I was ever chasing." Eleanor smiled, a small tired smile. "I used to think the world was done with me," she said, "but maybe it was only waiting for me to come home." Thomas reached into his coat and took out a small silver locket. He placed it in her hand. She opened it and saw a tiny photograph, faded but still clear, a woman and 4 small children. "They were my wife and little ones," he said softly. "Before the fever took them, this place was empty. After that, until you came along and filled it with life again." Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of something gentler. She closed the locket and held it tight against her chest. The morning stretched on, quiet and slow. The children's laughter drifted from the doorway. The world outside was still scarred from what had passed, but inside the cabin warmth began to return, one breath at a time. By midday, Thomas had mended the broken window and fixed the door. Eleanor cleaned the blood from the floorboards and lit fresh candles. When they sat together at the table later, there was no need for words. The silence between them was not empty but whole. As the sun began to fall again behind the ridge, Eleanor looked out across the valley and whispered, "The past buried its dead and left the living to build what they could." Thomas nodded beside her, his voice low but sure. "Then let's build something worth keeping." The days that followed were softer than the ones before. The snow melted slow on the mountain slopes and the streams began to sing again. The cabin that once felt heavy with ghosts now carried the rhythm of footsteps, laughter and the scent of bread and smoke. Eleanor found her peace in the small things. She mended the children's clothes, sang them to sleep, and tended the tiny garden that had somehow survived the frost. Her hands were never still, but her heart had quieted. The fear that had chased her for years had finally run out of breath. Thomas kept mostly to his work. He split wood, patched the roof, and rode down to the nearest town every few weeks for supplies. Each time he returned, he found the cabin looking more like a home than before, the smoke from its chimney rising straight into the sky like a prayer. Sometimes at night they would sit together by the fire. He'd talk in his low, steady voice about the years before she came, the cattle drives, the winters on the trail, and the men he'd known who never made it home. She'd listen, and when he'd go silent, she'd reach out and take his hand, grounding him back to the now. One evening as the fire burned low, Eleanor spoke quietly. "I think I've been running from ghosts all my life." Thomas turned to her, his face half shadowed. "Maybe it's time to stop running," she said. "Just stay where the world can't take anything more from us." He looked into her eyes, the kind that had seen too much and still dared to stay kind. "I think you already stopped," he said gently. "You've been home for a while now, just didn't know it." Outside, the wind carried a soft hum through the pines. The moonlight fell across the valley, silver and calm. It was the first night in years neither of them dreamed of the past. Weeks later, word reached them that the man who'd haunted her had been buried in a shallow grave found by trappers downriver. No one knew his name, no one cared. To the mountain had taken what it was owed. Eleanor stood by the river, the same one that had nearly claimed her once, watching the water move fast and clear. She dropped a single wildflower into it and whispered a promise under her breath. "Thank you for letting me live." Thomas came up beside her and took her hand again. His grip was steady like the ground beneath her. She looked at him and knew she had found what she thought she never would, a place where she was safe, seen and needed. Spring came early that year. The garden grew green and full. The children played under open skies and the valley bloomed. The pain that had filled their lives was still there, but it was smaller now, something that lived in the corners and not in their hearts. One morning Thomas saddled his horse and rode out to the ridge. He looked back at the cabin, at Eleanor standing in the doorway, sunlight in her hair and the sound of the children laughing inside. He realized then that he had done what few men ever could. He had kept his promise. He had brought her home. When he returned, she was waiting with a quiet smile and a table set for supper. The locket he'd given her hung around her neck, catching the firelight. That night the wind carried no ghosts, only the soft hum of life. The cabin stood steady against the dark, the mountain watching over it like a guardian of second chances. And when the stars came out clear and bright above them, Thomas whispered the words he'd never said aloud before. "You're home now, Eleanor, and I reckon I am too."